So, in our final segment for this week, we are going to be looking at how the notion of present value can be actually useful for characterizing certain other types of financial assets, such as perpetuities and annuities. And we'll see that there are some very useful shortcuts to know that often helps us in kind of valuing this sort of assets, right? So, as we have seen, and as we'll continue to see, present value formula is useful for valuing various investments such as stocks and bonds. And as you have seen that investments typically have multiple payments associated with them. Uh, but the cases that we have been seeing so far are like relatively simple cases where you have got, at most, I think 5 payments that we have seen, right? However, in reality, stocks have dividends, which often pay out for a much longer time span. And housing loans often have like more than 200 monthly payments, right? So, for example, if you have taken out a housing loan, which pays out over 20 years, then that would involve at least 240 monthly payments, right? So in that case, working directly with the present value formula is a bit cumbersome. And there are often some useful shortcut formulas that have come up that can speed up computations if the project under consideration has a particular type of cash flow patterns and the opportunity cost of capital is constant. So we are going to be studying two such examples, namely perpetuities and annuities. So perpetuities are basically assets which have got payments lasting forever, and annuities have payments lasting for a limited number of years, right? So these are two particular classes for which we'll see how this can be easily calculated, the value of such classes. Okay. All right, so let us start with that. So first, let's start with perpetuities. A simple perpetuity is a project with a constant cash flow that repeats forever. Now, already when we say that something repeats forever, this is clearly an approximation, right? Because nothing lasts forever. However, we'll see that this is kind of like very useful for quickly getting in some back of the envelope calculations and some numbers, right? So let's do a calculation to see how this works. So imagine that you have a constant rate of 10%, which is going to be the same forever. And the question is, at this constant rate of interest, how much money does one need to invest today in order to receive the same amount, which is 20 units per year, starting next year forever, right? So if we kind of like think conceptually, we already know the answer to this question. So the answer to this is that figure out what's the present value of a stream of payments which begins with from next year, which is equal to 20. The year after that, it's 20, and so on. And kind of like discount it appropriately and then sum it up, right? So here the interest rate is given to you as 10%. So therefore, the discounting of the first payment, which is in the next year, is going to be 20 divided by 1.1. So that's the present value of that payment. The payment 1 year later is has to be discounted by 1.1 square. So therefore, the present value of that is 20 divided by 1.1 square, and so on, right? So, but this is basically an infinite sum. And in fact, if you kind of recognize it, this is the infinite GP sum, right? And so we can adopt the formula of infinite geometric progression that you have seen from your high school. And then you can show that if you take this as common, then this common factor is basically 1 by 1.1. And so therefore the final outcome is equal to 200, right? So that's basically how you get this formula for valuing perpetuity. And we can state the general result here, right? So imagine that you have got a stream of constant cash flows, which is equal to C, and this begins from next period onwards, and every period onwards, it's going to give you C each period, okay? And imagine that the interest rate or the per period cost of capital is R, and it's going to remain at R forever. Then the value of this stream of constant cash flows is going to be equal to C by R, right? How do we get this number? Basically, again, it's exactly the same idea as you had here. So basically, you are going to have C divided by 1 plus R plus C divided by 1 plus R squared plus C divided by 1 plus R cube. So again, infinite GP series. And from there, you kind of can calculate that this is going to be equal to C by R, right? So this is the present value from time period zero's perspective, right? So one thing that you have to be careful about when you apply this formula is to note that the first payment is actually going to begin from one period forward, right? If you instead you had the first payment beginning from period zero onwards, then this formula needs to be changed, and then the present value actually becomes C plus C by R. So pay careful attention to when is the payment beginning before you start applying this formula. Okay. The second thing to be careful of is that in the denominator, you do not have 1 plus r, but you have r, right? So in this example, for instance, you had actually r was equal to zero point 0.1. So therefore, the answer was 20 divided by zero point 0.1 or 200, right? And it was not 20 divided by 1 plus r. So again, be careful of making mistakes like that. Okay, let's now modify this case. And instead of having something which is going to be constant throughout, what happens if you have the cash flow increasing over time, right? So this is typically often the case because sometimes you might have requirement that the cash flow that is coming in has to be kind of linked to inflation, for example, right? So that would be an example where you would expect that the cash flow would be increasing over time, because if it is constant because of inflation, the value of that keeps going down, right? So in this case, we can use a growing perpetuity formula if the rate at which this increase is happening is constant, okay? And this can be used as long as the rate of increase of the cash flow is less than the interest rate. So let's take a look at such an example. So suppose that you want to value today a cash flow stream that pays 20 units next year and grows at a rate of 5%. Okay. And it says a cost of capital of 10%. Okay. So again, what you do is first you figure out what are the cash flow. So the first cash flow is going to be next year, it's going to be 20. The next cash flow is going to be the year afterwards. So it's going to be 20 multiplied by 1.05. Then the year afterwards, it's going to be 20 multiplied by 1.05 square, right? So you can see that this is growing at a rate of 5%. And then you need to take the present discounted value of each of these cash flows and then add up, right? So the first year's cash flow appropriately discounted is 20 divided by 1.1. The next year it's 20 into 1.05 divided by 1.1 square and so on, right? And if you do the calculation, this is again an application of the geometric series, and you can show that this sum is basically nothing but 20 divided by zero point 0.1 minus 0.05 or 400, right? Okay. We can actually generalize this. So let's look at the general formula for the growing perpetuity valuation. So imagine that you have a stream of cash flows which is growing at a rate g each period, and it's discounted at the same interest rate of r forever. Then the present discounted value of that is given by c1 divided by r minus g, where c1 is the first cash flow that is occurring in period 1, and the second cash flow is going to be c1 multiplied by 1 plus g and so on, right? Notice that clearly we require, in order for this formula to make any sense, that r has to be greater than g, right? Otherwise, you are going to get something which is negative, which does not make sense. So actually, what happens when you have got r is less than g is that basically you are going to get kind of like an infinite sum, right? So that's why this formula doesn't make sense here that you have, okay? So keep in mind that this formula works only when you have got r is greater than g. Okay, so the third example that we have is what is known as an annuity, right? So what is the annuity? So annuity is something that pays the same amount of money for a given number of years, right? So in this example, it's going to pay for T years, right? So the main difference for perpetuity, which remain, but it's also something that pays out the same amount, is that perpetuity pays out the amount forever, right? Whereas an annuity pays it out only for a fixed number of years, so that in an annuity, payments actually stop after T periods and does not go on forever, right? So for example, if the interest rate is 10% per period, what is the value of an annuity that pays 50 per period for 3 years? Well, you can calculate the present discounted value easily. But if you had an example which required you to calculate the annuity for 10 periods, then this would not have been such an easy process, right? And then we need to be a bit more clever about how we go about calculating this. And this is the general result. So if you have got a stream of constant equal cash flows beginning next period as usual and lasting for T periods, and if it is discounted at a constant interest rate R, then this is worth, in today's terms, an amount which is given by this annuity formula, right? So C by R multiplied by 1 minus 1 by 1 plus R to the power T, right? Where C is the equal cash flow that we have been talking about, right? So one another way of thinking about this annuity formula is to kind of recognize that this is can be thought of as if it's a perpetuity. except for the fact that you are kind of giving out extra payments compared to perpetuity. So how much extra payments are you giving out? Well, you are giving out extra payment which is equal to another perpetuity which begins from t plus 1 onwards, right? So therefore, what you have is one initial perpetuity, which is value of C by R, because it's going to pay out C beginning from next period, and the interest rate is R. So we already know what the perpetuity formula is. But from there, you need to subtract out the fact that from T plus 1 onwards, you are not going to get the amount C. So you have in some ways overcounted, right? And so you need to adjust it by subtracting out the value of a perpetuity that begins from T plus 1 onwards, right? So the value of that perpetuity T plus 1 onwards is C by R from time T's perspective. And if you now want to convert the time T amount to time zero amount, you need to discount it appropriately, which is the discount factor corresponding to time T, right? So this 1 by 1 plus R to the power T. Okay, so this is like the way to remember in case you forget this formula. So this all these three formulas, annuity formula, perpetuity formula, and growing perpetuity formula, you should actually make sure that you remember, okay? Because those are often useful for doing calculations. So let's take a couple of examples to see how these formulas are actually applied. So imagine that David has taken part in and has won a quiz show, MU, where the M stands for millionaire. So as a result of winning this quiz, then this MU has actually offered David a prize worth 1 million units. So you can think of it as rupees, which will be paid out in 20 equal installments of 50,000 units per year, starting 1 year from now. Okay. And there's going to be a one new installment each year for the next 20 years. Okay. So the claim in the newspaper is that David is now a millionaire overnight as a result of its winning. And how did they come up with this million number? Because this is the total prize that has been awarded, right? However, before the celebrations started in David's household, he had a relative who was studying finance, and he suggested, well, the deal is not as good as it looks, right? And the reason is because if you actually kind of like think about the value of the price, this is actually less than what the stated amount is, right? So the value is actually less than 500,000, right? So at that time, the interest rate was 10%, and this was expected to remain at that rate forever. Okay, so this is an important piece of information that the relative used to calculate. So one question is, who is correct? Are the newspapers correct, or is the relative correct? Well, in order to answer this question, we need to actually calculate the present value of winnings, right? So this is an amount where you are going to get paid 50,000 in year one, 50,000 in year two, and so on, right? And so therefore, this is an annuity which pays out 50,000 each period, beginning from one period onwards, and it pays out for 20 years, right? So you can actually kind of like back up and look up this formula that we had here. So here C will be 50,000, R is 0.1 because the interest rate is 10%, 1 minus 1 plus R, so 1.1 to the power 20, right? And clearly you can see from here that the present value of this is actually something which is less than 500,000, right? So the relative was actually correct that in terms of the money that he has gone, if you calculate the value today, this is an amount which is less than 500,000. Okay, let's look at one final application. And we are back to our world of bonds. And as a result of this application, we'll see two things, right? One, we'll introduce you to some more new terminology related to bonds, because this is again something which is very jargon heavy. And the second thing that we are going to do is we are going to see how annuity formulas kind of like help to simplify a lot of calculations, right? So remember that a bond is a financial claim that can be sold by a firm or a government. And bonds come in varying varieties. And some of the terms that you hear are something called coupon bonds and zero bonds, right? So what is a coupon bond? So this is a bond which pays its holder cash at many different points in time. And this is in contrast to a zero bond. By the way, it's called zero bond because it's a short for zero coupon bond. So the zero bond is something that only pays out a single lump sum amount at the end or the maturity period of the bond, and there is no interim kind of like payments that is coming out, right? So basically what you have in this coupon bonds cases is that you have got a promise of paying out regular payments, right? So this is a payment regularly, and then at the end you return a principal amount plus a final coupon at the end of the bond period, right? So that's the idea in this sense. So let's take a particular example. Suppose that you have a coupon bond that is going to pay 1500 units each half year for the next 5 years. And then it's going to pay out an additional 1 lakh units in 5 years' time. Okay. So if you have a bond which is a payment schedule like this is actually an example of what is known as a level coupon bond. So how do we see this? So basically a bond with coupon payments that remain the same for the life of the bond is something that is known as a level coupon bond. So here, because the bond coupon payments are 1500 throughout the life of the bond, so that's why it's an example of a level coupon bond. And this 1 lakh units that is going to be paid out at the end, that's going to be the principal. And the coupon here would be 1500 semi-annual coupons. Why semi-annual? Because the payment is going to happen twice a year. Okay. So the level bonds are often kind of like named by adding up all the coupons over 1 year. So here, remember, each 6 months you are going to be paid 1500. So over the entire year, you're going to be paid 3000. And then you need to divide the sum of the annual coupon payments by the principal. So here the principal was 1 lakh. So if you divide 3000 by 1 lakh, you get 3%, right? So the bond would be described as a 3% semi-annual coupon bond, right? Where are we getting the 3%? That's the 3000 divided by 1 lakh. Semi-annual because it pays out twice, and it's a coupon bond because it is actually paying out coupons, right? And note that this is actually a naming convention. This 3% does not have anything to do with whatever is the interest rate, right? Because this is how we calculated it, right? So one question that we might have is that how do you value such a bond today, assuming that the interest rate is 5% per annum, right? So how would we go about doing it? So there are two ways in which you can do it. One is that you start systematically thinking step by step and applying the present value formula, right? So in that case, the first step is to figure out the bond payments at different time points. So at years 0.5, 1, 1.5 till 4.5, each period, the bond payment is 1500 units, right? So this is the coupon payment. The final period, which is going to happen at year 5, the bond payment is that coupon amount, 1500, plus the principal amount, 1 lakh. So that the total payment at year 5 is going to be 101,500, right? So this is the bond payments that is coming out at different time periods. The next thing that you have to figure out is that you need to actually kind of like discount this payments that is going to happen in the future, right? So what should the bond payment at year 0.5 be discounted by? So the discount factor should be 1 by 1 plus r to the power t, right? So here t is 0.5, r is 5% because that information is something that was given to us. And so therefore we can calculate the discount factor at year 0.5, at year 1 it will be 1 by 1.05 and so on, right? So this is the general formula. Once you have the discount factor, you can use that to calculate the present value for each of the bond payments, and you can then add them up to get the bond's overall value. So for example, the present value of the bond payment at year 0.5 would be 1500 divided by 1.05 to the power 0.5, right? And so on, you can calculate. Once you have all this 10 different components, you find out the present value of that. And if you add them up, the sum becomes 91,501.42. So this is the step-by-step method, right? Now, the annuity formula actually provides you with a very useful shortcut for calculating the bonds value in this case, right? So think of it as two components. You have got every half year period, the bond is providing 10 coupon flows, each of which is equal to 1500 at a per period interest rate of 2.47%. How are you getting this 2.47%? You basically get it from this here. Okay. All right. So then basically you can apply the annuity formula to this. So this is you have got 1500 by R, so 2.47%, 1 minus 1 plus R to the power 10. And this is the amount that you end up getting from there, right? Okay. In addition to this, remember there is one final payment, which is 100,000, which we have not included here. And this happens at year 5. So that has a present discounted value of 100,000 divided by 1 plus R to the power 5, right? And this is equal to 78,352.62. So now if you add up the two, you end up getting 91,501.42, which is again the amount that you had before. But you can see that this involved us doing much less calculations compared to before, right? So one final piece of terminology, since the value of the bonds here was less than the named principal amount of 100,000, we are going to say that the bond is going to trade at a discount. In contrast, we will say that a bond is going to trade at a premium if the value of the bonds is actually more than the named principal amount. So this is again a piece of terminology that is used a lot. So finally, the main references for this week has been this textbook, which is available online for free. It's called Corporate Finance by Ivo Welch, and we have focused on chapters 2 and 3. So please look into it for more examples, more details, and more explanations than what we had. And we used a part of intermediate microeconomics to think about the intertemporal choice and so on, right? So that is our kind of like discussion. And we'll continue with our this insight into this kind of like corporate, like, by looking at different other capital budgeting rules and also incorporating in elements which we have abstracted away from so far, such as different interest rates, uncertainty, and so on in the upcoming lecture next week. So that's coming up next.